Close your eyes and imagine this. It is the summer of 1462. The Ottoman army, 90,000 strong, moves like a dark tide across the Danube, pushing into Wallachia with banners raised and drums echoing across the hills. These men are veterans of conquest. They are the soldiers of Sultan Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople, master of one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known. To them, this campaign should be nothing more than another victory, another land absorbed into the Sultan's realm. But as the vast army presses forward, something feels wrong. The villages they pass through are not filled with frightened peasants. Instead, they are silent, empty. The fields yield no grain, the wells are poisoned, and the homes are nothing but smoldering ruins. The smell of smoke and death clings to the wind. Horses stumble on scorched earth, soldiers collapse from thirst, and whispers of unease ripple through the ranks. And then, one night, as Mehmed's army approaches the Wallachian capital of Targovist, they finally see him, not in the flesh, but in the forest of horrors he has left behind. Tens of thousands of figures rise in the moonlight, impaled on tall wooden stakes, stretching as far as the eye can see. Ottoman soldiers, captured scouts, even diplomats, each body positioned with chilling precision, each face twisted in agony. The sight is so overwhelming that hardened warriors, men who had stormed the walls of Constantinople itself, reel back in terror. For the first time, doubt seeps into their minds. Who is this man who fights not with armies, but with terror itself? His name is Vlad Țepeș. History remembers him as Vlad the Impaler. To his enemies, he was a monster. To his people, a protector. But one truth is undeniable. He turned fear into a weapon so powerful, it forced even the greatest empire of his time to hesitate. This is not just a story of cruelty. It is a story of strategy, of psychology, of how one man rewrote the rules of warfare, by making terror itself the battlefield. To understand why Vlad the Impaler resorted to such brutal tactics, we must first understand the world he lived in, a world where small kingdoms balanced precariously between survival and annihilation. The year was 1462, and Europe stood at a crossroads. Less than a decade earlier, in 1453, Sultan Mehmed II had achieved the impossible by conquering Constantinople. That single victory did more than topple the thousand-year-old Byzantine Empire. It sent a shockwave across Christendom. Overnight, the Ottomans became the unstoppable force of the age, pushing relentlessly into the Balkans and beyond. Wallachia, Vlad's homeland, was no mighty empire. It was a small principality wedged between great powers, Hungary to the west, the Ottoman Empire to the south, and Moldavia to the north. Its rolling hills and dense forests could not match the armies or wealth of its neighbors. For centuries, Wallachian rulers had survived by walking a dangerous tightrope, paying tribute to the Ottomans while trying to preserve autonomy. But Vlad III, born into blood and betrayal, was not a man content to bow quietly. He had spent part of his youth as a political hostage in the Ottoman court, where he learned firsthand both the strength of Mehmed's empire and the cruelty of its politics. When he returned to claim the throne of Wallachia, he carried with him a burning hatred of Ottoman domination and a fierce determination to defend his land at any cost. Still, the odds were impossibly stacked against him. Mehmed II could summon armies numbering in the tens of thousands, armed with advanced siege weapons and hardened by years of conquest. Vlad, by comparison, had only a few tens of thousands of men, many of them peasants with little training. A direct confrontation on the battlefield would mean certain defeat. Yet Vlad understood something deeper. War was not only about numbers, steel, or fortresses. It was also about psychology. If he could not match Mehmed in sheer force, he would make the land itself his ally. He would break the will of the invader not through open battle, but through fear, starvation, and doubt. And so, when Mehmed launched his grand invasion of Wallachia in 1462, he did not march into a land prepared to surrender. Instead, he marched into a nightmare carefully crafted by Vlad, one that would test the very limits of Ottoman morale. When Sultan Mehmed II's great host first crossed into Wallachia, they expected resistance. They anticipated villages bristling with armed men, barricades and forests, fortresses prepared to resist siege. What they did not expect was emptiness. The Ottoman army moved forward, and found only silence. Smoke rose from distant hills. The land was blackened, fields reduced to ash, wells filled with carrion, and granaries smashed to dust. Villages once alive with children, farmers, and church bells now lay abandoned or destroyed. In some cases, entire populations had been evacuated deeper into Wallachia. In others, they had been slaughtered. Nothing was left for the invader but a wasteland. This was no accident. Vlad the Impaler had deliberately ordered the systematic destruction of his own countryside. Crops were burned, livestock driven away or killed, and homes reduced to ruins. What looked like senseless cruelty was, in truth, a cold calculation. Vlad understood the arithmetic of survival. With only a fraction of the troops Mehmed commanded, he could never win in open battle. But by denying the Ottomans food, shelter, and information, he could turn the very land against them. In a letter to his ally, King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, Vlad described his actions without hesitation. "I have killed peasants, men and women, old and young. We have burned down everything." These were not the words of a merciless brute, but of a ruler laying out a strategy of necessity. For Vlad, war was total, and his homeland would be the weapon. For the Ottoman army, the psychological effect was immediate. These were men accustomed to conquest, to marching into fertile valleys and seizing supplies to sustain themselves. Now, every mile deeper into Wallachia brought only despair. Soldiers grew hungry and weak. Horses collapsed, unable to graze. Diseases spread through the camps as men drank from poisoned wells. Fear turned to suspicion. If the land itself seemed cursed, what horrors might still await them deeper within? In many ways, Scorched Earth was as much a mental assault as a physical one. Hunger gnawed at the belly, but doubt gnawed at the mind. Where was the enemy? Why did the villages vanish before them? Every burned house was a reminder that Vlad was watching, planning, always one step ahead. History is filled with examples of scorched earth, but rarely has it been executed with such ferocity. By destroying his own resources, Vlad signaled to Mehmed that he was willing to sacrifice everything, his land, his people, even his legacy, to deny victory to the invader. This message carried a terrifying weight. If a man would destroy his own home, what would he do to his enemies? Psychologically, it placed the Sultan in a bind. To retreat meant humiliation. To advance meant entering deeper into a nightmare where every step forward cost morale, supplies, and lives. The very emptiness of Wallachia became a weapon sharper than any sword. Modern psychology helps us understand why this tactic was so devastating. Humans are wired to seek control and predictability. Armies, especially, thrive on routine, food, rest, clear objectives. By stripping away all sense of stability, Vlad plunged Mehmed's forces into uncertainty. Soldiers who should have been thinking of battle instead thought of their stomachs, their thirst, and their growing fear of the unseen enemy. It is no exaggeration to say that Vlad turned Wallachia into a theater of terror. Every burned field was a stage, every poisoned well a line in his performance. He wasn't simply fighting Mehmed's men, he was dismantling their will to fight. The Scorched Earth campaign marked the opening act of Vlad's psychological war. It was a brutal choice, one that condemned his own land to suffering, but it set the tone for everything that followed. By the time Mehmed's forces reached the heart of Wallachia, they were already weakened, not by battle, but by fear, exhaustion, and despair. And Vlad had only begun to play his hand. If the Scorched Earth campaign weakened Mehmed's army through hunger and exhaustion, what awaited them next would attack their very souls. For in the summer of 1462, as the Ottoman host advanced deeper into Wallachia, they stumbled upon one of the most horrifying scenes ever recorded in the chronicles of war, the Forest of the Impaled. Outside the citadel of Targovist, the Wallachian capital, thousands upon thousands of bodies rose into the sky, mounted on towering wooden stakes. Some estimates put the number at 20,000. Men, women, prisoners of war, Ottoman scouts, even Wallachians accused of treachery, all displayed with grim precision. Under the hot sun, their forms twisted grotesquely, their faces frozen in masks of agony. Arranged in rows and patterns, the stakes stretched across the fields like a macabre city of the dead. For the Ottoman soldiers, hardened though they were, the sight was unbearable. These were men who had stormed Constantinople, who had stood in blood-soaked battlefields without flinching. Yet here, confronted with the sheer scale of Vlad's cruelty, many recoiled. Chroniclers describe soldiers turning pale, murmurs spreading through the ranks, and even seasoned warriors admitting that their courage faltered. The display was not random. Vlad had choreographed it like a performance. High-ranking prisoners were placed near the front, their fates made visible as trophies. Captured envoys who had once refused to remove their turbans before Vlad had those very turbans nailed to their skulls before being raised aloft. The message was clear: defiance would be answered with humiliation and death. Every stake was not just an execution, it was a statement, carved in flesh and wood. This was psychological warfare in its most visceral form. War has always carried the threat of death, but Vlad's stakes added a new dimension: the annihilation of dignity. Soldiers knew that to fall into his hands meant not just dying, but becoming a spectacle of suffering, a warning to others. In stripping his enemies of humanity, Vlad magnified their terror. Mehmed II himself was shaken. According to both Ottoman and European chroniclers, the Sultan halted his advance at the site. This was no ordinary battlefield obstacle. It was a deliberate attempt to confront him personally, to show him the price of pressing forward. One Ottoman historian recorded Mehmed's chilling remark: "It is not possible to defeat a man who does such things to his own people, let alone his enemies." But why was this so effective? Modern psychology gives us a clue. Humans are deeply visual creatures. Symbols and images have the power to bypass reason and strike directly at the subconscious. The Forest of the Impaled was not just an execution ground, it was a symbol of domination, designed to burn itself into memory. In seeing thousands of stakes, the soldiers of Mehmed's army did not merely witness death, they saw a future version of themselves. Fear became contagious, spreading like fire through the ranks. Moreover, the display attacked the Ottoman identity itself. These were not anonymous victims, they were comrades, fellow Muslims, even emissaries of the Sultan. To see them desecrated in such a way was to feel a collective insult, a humiliation aimed not at individuals but at the empire as a whole. For Vlad, this was the essence of his strategy: to force his enemies to confront their own vulnerability, to make them question not only their strength but their very mission. And in that moment of doubt, when the mind faltered, his smaller army gained an advantage far greater than numbers. The Forest of the Impaled became the most infamous chapter of Vlad's reign, cementing his reputation across Europe. To his enemies, it was proof of barbarity. To his supporters, it was evidence of his unyielding defense. But for Mehmed's army, it was something far more personal, a vision of horror that lingered long after the march, a nightmare that whispered, "This is your fate." Vlad had taken cruelty and transformed it into theater. With his forest of death, he showed that sometimes the sharpest weapon in war is not the sword, but the image burned into the mind. Impalement was not invented by Vlad the Impaler. The brutal practice existed long before his time, in various empires and across continents. The Ottomans themselves employed it on occasion, as did other medieval rulers. But Vlad refined it, turned it into something more than punishment. In his hands, impalement became a language, a system of law, and above all, a theater of power. Within Wallachia, Vlad's authority was fragile. He ruled a principality squeezed between greater empires, where treachery and shifting loyalties were everyday realities. Noble families plotted for influence, peasants resisted taxation, and outside forces, Hungary, the Ottomans, and Moldavia, pulled at the seams of his rule. For a leader in such a precarious position, mere diplomacy was not enough. Order had to be carved into the land. And so, impalement was not reserved only for foreign invaders. It was applied ruthlessly to his own subjects. Thieves, liars, adulterers, corrupt officials, all could find themselves raised on a stake if they defied the code Vlad sought to enforce. Contemporary chronicles recount gruesome examples: a woman impaled for lying about her husband's labor to avoid work, merchants punished for cheating customers, even nobles who plotted against him left to rot on the stakes outside city walls. To the modern mind, this seems like cruelty beyond comprehension. Yet to Vlad, it was justice. He believed that fear was the most effective deterrent against chaos. In a land constantly threatened by invasion and betrayal, he sought to unify his people under one principle: obedience, enforced by terror. In this sense, impalement was not merely an execution, it was a warning carved in flesh, a performance meant to ripple through the collective psyche of Wallachia. Foreign observers were both horrified and impressed. German and Saxon chroniclers painted him as a monster, a devil incarnate who delighted in torture. But Slavic and Romanian sources, closer to his homeland, often described him with grudging respect, even admiration. They saw a ruler who, though merciless, brought order in a time of chaos. For them, the stakes represented not random violence, but the price of security. The psychological effect was profound. For the Ottomans, impalement was terror. For the Wallachians, it was law. The sight of bodies raised high above the ground, left to decay under sun and rain, etched into memory a lesson few dared to challenge. Betrayal would be answered not just with death, but with humiliation, suffering, and public disgrace. Why was this so effective? Because human beings fear not only death, but the loss of dignity. To die quietly in battle was one thing. To die writhing on a stake, exposed for days, was another. Vlad weaponized this fear to ensure loyalty. In doing so, he controlled both his enemies and his own people through the same tool, terror as governance. From a psychological perspective, this reflects a principle still studied today: the power of symbolic punishment. When a ruler punishes publicly and excessively, the punishment transcends the individual and becomes a spectacle for the community. It creates a shared understanding of boundaries, enforced not by persuasion, but by fear. Vlad understood this instinctively. Each impalement was less about the condemned and more about the audience. The peasants, the nobles, the foreign envoys, all of whom carried the image with them. But there was another layer, one that made Vlad truly unique. He staged his executions with deliberate care. The stakes were not placed haphazardly. They were arranged in rows, circles, and patterns, almost like grim works of art. This turned horror into ritual, brutality into symbolism. It was governance by theater, a performance so shocking it defined his identity for centuries. To his contemporaries, Vlad was both tyrant and protector. To later generations, he became Dracula, the archetype of the Dark Prince. But strip away the myth, and what remains is this: Vlad III understood that in a fractured land, fear could be more binding than love, and terror more reliable than loyalty. With impalement as his chosen instrument, he did not just punish enemies, he reshaped the very psychology of his realm. And in doing so, he blurred the line between ruler and executioner, between justice and horror, between order and nightmare. If Scorched Earth denied the Ottomans resources, and the forest of the Impaled assaulted their courage, Vlad's next move reached into something even deeper: the human fear of disfigurement, humiliation, and a fate worse than death. For Vlad the Impaler, execution was not always the final word. Sometimes, survival was the cruelest punishment of all. During the 1462 campaign, numerous chronicles, Slavic, Saxon, and Ottoman, describe how Vlad captured groups of Ottoman soldiers. Some he impaled, adding them to his gruesome displays. But others, he deliberately spared. Not because of mercy. Not because of diplomacy. These men were transformed into instruments of psychological warfare. Vlad mutilated them. Noses, ears, and lips were cut away. Eyes were gouged or damaged. Fingers and limbs were crippled. Some were branded with hot irons, leaving grotesque marks burned into their flesh. Others bore symbols etched into their skin, mocking reminders of their humiliation. And then, after inflicting this torment, Vlad sent them back. Released, not as free men, but as living warnings to their comrades. The strategy was as brilliant as it was cruel. Executed enemies are silent. Mutilated survivors, however, speak. They carry terror with them into every campfire conversation, every whispered story among soldiers. The mere sight of them, broken, deformed, forever scarred, was enough to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of even the most disciplined warriors. These men did not need to explain what had been done. Their bodies spoke for them. In Ottoman culture, as in most medieval societies, honor was tied not only to courage in battle but also to the body itself. To be disfigured was to suffer more than physical pain. It was to lose dignity, manhood, and spiritual wholeness. Vlad's mutilations struck at this very identity. Soldiers returned not as martyrs, but as living reminders of failure, humiliation, and degradation. In this way, he did not just harm individuals. He weakened the morale of entire units. From a psychological perspective, this tactic taps into a primal fear, the fear of surviving in shame. Death can be noble, but mutilation lingers. It strips away the possibility of glory and leaves only horror. When Ottoman soldiers saw their comrades return in such conditions, the question that haunted them was not, "Will I die?" but, "What will be done to me if I am captured?" That question erodes resolve faster than any sword. This tactic also mocked Mehmed II directly. To release captives in such a state was to send a message to the Sultan: "I do not fear you. I will carve my insults into the flesh of your men and send them back to you." For an emperor who had prided himself on discipline, strength, and imperial honor, this was a calculated affront. Vlad was not simply resisting, he was taunting. Imagine the effect in the Ottoman camp. At night, around the fires, soldiers would see the broken forms of their comrades, hear their halting voices, and feel terror creeping into their own bones. Morale, already weakened by scorched earth and hunger, now suffered under this new weight, the living proof of Vlad's cruelty. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this strategy is its paradoxical logic. By letting some captives live, Vlad gave them a fate far worse than those who had perished on the stakes. They were not martyrs for the Ottoman cause. They were tools in Vlad's theater of terror, unwilling actors in a play meant to break the will of an empire. In modern terms, this was psychological operations at their rawest form. Today, armies wage war with propaganda, disinformation, and staged images designed to weaken the enemy's morale. Vlad did the same, but with human bodies. He understood that the most terrifying story is not the one told in books or proclamations, but the one carried by survivors who have looked into hell and returned. The mutilated prisoners of Vlad Țepeș were not spared to live. They were spared to terrify. They became living messages, walking letters carved in flesh, declarations of defiance delivered straight into the heart of Mehmed's camp. And in this way, Vlad proved again that he did not need victory in numbers. He needed only to poison the mind. When Sultan Mehmed II led his massive army into Wallachia in 1462, he expected a swift and decisive campaign. His forces outnumbered Vlad's by staggering margins, his empire dwarfed Wallachia in wealth and power, and his reputation as the conqueror of Constantinople carried an aura of invincibility. Yet what he encountered was not a battle in the conventional sense. It was a descent into a nightmare crafted with surgical precision by Vlad the Impaler. By the time Mehmed's army reached the Wallachian heartland, they were already battered by the scorched earth policy. They were hungry, thirsty, and increasingly unnerved by the emptiness of the land. Then came the forest of the Impaled, a vision of horror so overwhelming that even the Sultan himself hesitated. And finally, the mutilated captives returning to Ottoman lines brought terror from the battlefield into the soldiers' very tents. The cumulative effect was profound. Ottoman chronicles reveal that morale in the camp began to collapse. Soldiers deserted, others fell ill from contaminated water, and still others whispered about omens and curses. Men who had once believed themselves part of an unstoppable empire now questioned whether they were marching to victory or into damnation. Mehmed himself was forced to reckon with an uncomfortable reality. Military strength had carried him across half of Europe, but here, against a foe vastly weaker in numbers, he was stalled not by fortresses or armies but by fear. Vlad had rewritten the rules of warfare. The battlefield was not the field or the city walls, it was the human mind. Yet the cost for Wallachia was immense. Vlad's scorched earth campaign meant that his own people suffered terribly. Villages were destroyed, harvests lost, and civilians displaced or killed to deny resources to the Ottomans. To many in his homeland, he was both protector and tormentor, a ruler who defended their land by sacrificing it. Outside Wallachia, Vlad's reputation grew in two directions at once. In Ottoman records and Saxon chronicles, he became the embodiment of cruelty, a monster whose savagery defied comprehension. Tales of his impalements, mutilations, and psychological cruelty spread across Europe, magnified by rumor and imagination. To his enemies, he was not merely a warlord, he was the devil's own prince. But among some of his own people, and in certain parts of Europe, he was remembered differently. He was the ruler who dared to resist the greatest empire of the age, who did not cower before Mehmed II. To them, his brutality was not madness but necessity, a shield forged of terror to protect a small principality from annihilation. Psychologically, Vlad's campaign demonstrated a truth that resonates even in modern times. Fear is as much a weapon as steel. Hunger, horror, humiliation, these break armies as surely as swords and arrows. Vlad instinctively grasped what military strategists centuries later would codify: That morale can decide wars as decisively as numbers. For the Ottomans, the campaign did not end in conquest. Though they inflicted damage and briefly occupied parts of Wallachia, Mehmed ultimately withdrew, his forces depleted and demoralized. The unbeatable empire had been forced to hesitate before a vastly weaker foe. That hesitation was Vlad's victory. In the centuries that followed, the legacy of this campaign lingered. Vlad's name became synonymous with cruelty, inspiring the legends that would one day morph into the tale of Count Dracula. But beneath the myth lies a more complex truth. Vlad Țepeș was not simply a sadist. He was a ruler who understood, perhaps better than any of his contemporaries, that terror could be harnessed as a deliberate strategy. The psychological impact of his tactics rippled far beyond 1462. They became a case study in how power can be exercised not only through might, but through fear. His enemies left Wallachia haunted. His people lived under his iron hand, bound together by the knowledge that disobedience meant death on a stake. And history, caught between horror and admiration, still struggles to decide. Was he a tyrant or a visionary strategist? Perhaps he was both. For in the end, Vlad the Impaler proved one thing beyond doubt, that the most devastating battlefield is not the land beneath one's feet, but the human mind. In the summer of 1462, Sultan Mehmed II marched into Wallachia expecting to crush a minor principality. What he encountered instead was a campaign unlike any other in medieval history. The burned fields, the poisoned wells, the forest of the impaled, the mutilated survivors, each act was part of a deliberate strategy. Vlad the Impaler fought not with sheer numbers or superior arms, but with the darkest of human emotions. He turned fear itself into a weapon. The results were undeniable. Mehmed, the conqueror of Constantinople, was forced to retreat. Though the Ottomans remained a looming threat in the Balkans, Vlad had succeeded in something extraordinary. He made the mightiest empire of his age hesitate. For a ruler of a small and vulnerable land, that hesitation was victory enough. Yet the cost was staggering. Wallachia itself was scarred, its people caught between the cruelty of their ruler and the threat of foreign conquest. Vlad's scorched earth policies devastated the countryside. His reign of terror, though effective, left deep wounds in his own society. For his people, survival came at the price of fear, obedience, and suffering. History has struggled to define Vlad ever since. To the Ottomans and many European chroniclers, he was a monster whose cruelty surpassed imagination. To others, particularly in his homeland, he was remembered as a fierce defender, a man who refused to bow to overwhelming power. This duality still shapes his legacy today. On one hand, Vlad became the inspiration for legends of Dracula, a name that has come to symbolize darkness, blood, and horror. His reputation as the Impaler eclipsed almost all other aspects of his rule. On the other hand, modern historians see him as a political leader navigating an impossible situation, wielding brutality as a calculated tool in a world where mercy was often fatal. Psychologically, his campaign offers timeless lessons. Fear is not merely an emotion, it is a force that can shape decisions, break armies, and alter history. Vlad instinctively grasped what strategists, generals, and even modern governments would later formalize, that the human mind is the ultimate battlefield. Terror does not just kill, it controls, paralyzes, and bends the will of entire nations. And yet, his story also poses an uncomfortable question. What is the price of ruling through fear? Vlad preserved Wallachia's independence for a time, but at the cost of turning his land into a stage for horror. His people obeyed, but not out of love, out of dread. His enemies retreated, but they carried with them tales of monstrosity that stained his memory forever. In the end, Vlad the Impaler's legacy cannot be reduced to a single image of hero or villain. He was both tyrant and tactician, both protector and executioner. His methods repel us, but they also fascinate us, because they reveal a truth about power that still resonates today. That fear, when wielded with precision, can rival the strongest armies. Perhaps this is why his story endures. Not because he was Dracula, nor because of the sheer cruelty of his deeds, but because he forces us to confront a deeper reality. In war, as in politics, the sharpest weapon is not always the sword or the cannon. Sometimes, it is the image burned into the mind, the fear that lingers long after the battle is over. And so, the forest of the impaled still stands in history's memory, not as wood and flesh, but as a symbol. A reminder that even the mightiest empire can be shaken, not by strength alone, but by terror.